Thank you all for being here. I think I may have forecast what I wanted to start talking about, and that's the 60 by 30 plan. And Dr. Gossman, maybe I'll start with you. Could you give your evaluation of where the 60 by 30 plan is now and if it's still the right plan for our state?
Yes, happy to do that. Thank you. So we are very close to our first benchmark year, which is 2020. This is a 15-year strategic plan from 2015 to 2030. We have 4 student-centered goals, and we are making progress in the right direction in all of the goals. We are moving up. But we are not moving fast enough to meet our first benchmark in 2020, so we still definitely have some work ahead of us. There is only one place where we are not moving up, and we could really use all of your help on this, and that is the high school to higher education direct enrollment. We are actually going down slightly on that regard, but we are still hopeful. We are still excited about the strategies we're hearing from the field on how to tackle this. But again, on everything else, we're moving up, just not fast enough.
Dr. Evans, from your perspective, looking at the 60 by 30 plan, what's working and what really needs more attention?
Well, part of it is partnering with industry and making sure that we are identifying core areas of competencies and skill levels that are necessary to be effective in the workforce. The other part, of course, is working with the community colleges and making sure that the handoff is seamless. Transfer and articulation sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. You need to be very closely aligned with the schools that you're principally recruiting from to be effective in that regard. The truth of the matter is, and Ginger didn't mention it, but the reality of low unemployment is that oftentimes you don't get the movement from high school into post-secondary, which you would get if the unemployment rate were different. The concern we all have there is that when that changes, and it always does, that the agility of those individuals in terms of being able to move in the marketplace is much reduced. So, by and large, I think we're doing the right things in that space. We could always do more, but I've got a great team of people that are working very effectively in that area.
Dr. Valek, Dr. Evans mentioned partnering with community colleges. From your perspective, and you're on the 60 by 30 committee for the association, how are those partnerships working? Where are you seeing areas of great success, and where you see the most critical gaps?
Well, I think as was mentioned, whenever you have a relationship with a receiving institution, you have the best success on those kinds of transfers and those handoffs. I think the challenge remains that for many community colleges, there isn't one match, but there's multiple matches. So you may have 4 to 5 transfer institutions where your students primarily go, and often the curriculum alignment is not the same for all, so it becomes more complex. I think, though, going back to where we need to go with this and where we have an opportunity is during the past session. SB 25, which was kind of known as the transfer bill, has now put together an opportunity for us to work even more in this area by the assignment of a special committee focused just on those types of transfer issues. So I'm optimistic about that. I know the coordinating board will be helping with the coordination of that, but that committee will be reporting directly to the legislature.
Ms. Williams, you have an interesting perspective because you're looking at this from a statewide point of view. Where do you see, what's your assessment of the 60 by 30 plan? How is it working? Where are the biggest areas of improvement from your opinion?
Right. So I think that in order for us to really get on track and reach the 60 by 30 plan, there has to be more of a prioritization from the Texas Legislature of higher education. And by prioritization, I mean money. So just for a little bit of background, right, for decades really, but especially beginning in 2000, the Texas Legislature started investing less and less in higher education, right? And at the same time, or in about 2003, the legislature voted to deregulate tuition, meaning that Texas public colleges and universities could charge unlimited tuition to students and families, right? So the burden of paying for higher education in Texas has significantly shifted to the backs of students and families, right? So getting towards, especially the debt aspect of the 60 by 30 plan, without state investment and prioritization of higher education, I think, would be very difficult.
It's like you were reading the next question on my card, because I wanted to spend some time talking about funding in the legislature because, Ms. Williams, we were both at the Texas Tribune Festival last week, and Dane Huberty, who's the public ed chair in the House, talked about the next session being a higher ed session in part. I'm interested with that to know what that means, and I would imagine that there's going to be a funding conversation as part of that. And I'm going to open this up to the whole panel. I'm just curious to hear what you're thinking in terms of funding and the aspect of what we should be looking for, what people should be asking for in terms of the funding requests for the next session in 2021, and what would be seen as successful, and what would that extra money, how would it be best used?
I'll be glad to tee that one off. I do hope we have a higher ed session next time. The legislature did a phenomenal job of working with public ed this time, and that was long overdue. And in that remedy, they put in some requirements for the handoff between high school and higher ed in the college and career readiness component. So from my perspective, that just makes a natural point where we ought to focus some work, because going back to what Dr. Grossman said, the area that we're the farthest behind on is that matriculation rate between high school into higher ed. So we have a whole untapped market there of folks who are going nowhere. And some of them may be going to the workforce, or they may not have a plan at all. But I think a lot of work on that nexus is very important, whether they go directly to the university or they go through the community college to the university. And so I would hope there would be focused revenue there to help us with that. It takes a lot more support to work with populations that we have today and to get them to understand that, one, they are college ready and they do belong and it is their right, but it takes a lot of support systems, and support systems need support in terms of money.
The moral hazard in reducing public support of higher ed and then making loan funds available at the federal level or otherwise is this incredible debt that these people incur. I had the dean of the College of Engineering at an event 2 or 3 days ago making comments at the beginning of a scholarship event, which is ironic. He's standing in front of people that have scholarships, and he's saying, I'm still paying my student loan debt off. And the tragedy of that is that it changes the way in which people can transition into their lives. And we've reached a point where we really are failing to see the greater scope of the life cycle of what people are going through, and we're focused exclusively on, can we get them through that transaction moment, getting them out of college? Well, that transaction has consequences, and we're failing to embrace the reality of those consequences.
So I would echo your comments about HB3. I think there is opportunity there not only to build back up that pipeline from high school to higher ed, but also built into HB3 is a little bit of outcomes-based funding for K-12, the K-12 system. So I would think there may be opportunities for higher ed folks to collaborate creatively with their ISD partners to help funnel, build out that pipeline again. The student debt goal really is a maintenance goal. That's 60% of first-year wages is a statewide goal that's not really designed to be specific to a sector, 2-year or 4-year, and it's certainly not intended to be at an individual student level. But it does, by design, draw attention to how higher ed is funded. So we were funneling the conversation that way by creating that goal. So I do hope that if the next session rolls around to be a higher ed discussion, that it's very much focused on the intent of the student debt goal and its design. And there are some things built into the targets of that goal that could help students reduce their debt, such as reducing the number of excess credit hours.
And I would add, One really important funding mechanism, of course, for Texas students and families. I myself am a Texas grant recipient, or its equivalent at two-year universities. There was some really great progress this last session in getting up to about 70% of students who are eligible to receive this need-based funding actually getting it. But that means that almost a third of students right now in Texas who have the financial need and can qualify for the Texas grant aren't receiving it, right? So I would love to see next session some more money put towards Texas grant and other need-based funding that's going to help students in terms of debt and paying for all of the things. College goes well beyond tuition and fees, we know, right? But putting as much money in the pockets of Texas students and families is something I would really love to see next session.
I want to go back to we talked about student debt. I want to talk bring this from the state level more to kind of like a on the ground level with the work that you do individually, and what are the conversations, because obviously this is a difficult system to navigate in terms of guiding students who are making some tough decisions about whether they can even afford to stay in school with the debt that they're collecting. What kind of conversations are you having? How are you what are the counseling services that you're able to provide, and that you're kind of changing up, and how you're addressing this to kind of help these students navigate as they're kind of going through this system, specifically with debt?
I assume you're directing that at me, which I'm happy to respond to. Obviously, part of it is through private funding. We've secured a considerable amount of gifts that make it possible for scholarships to be directed towards students. We help them through the financial aid space and navigate in that rather complicated environment. It's very difficult to figure out some of the sources that are available. I think one of the issues that we're seeing unfolding now with the funding formula is a concern about the 6-year graduation rate and potentially building that into the formula in a more aggressive way. Well, I would only offer that in the context of a student who's working full and part-time, often a first-generation student, frequently coming from a family that doesn't have the social economic wherewithal to help underwrite them, a graduation rate of 7 or even 8 years or 6.5 years is a tremendous accomplishment when you consider the amount of time that they're working. So the reality of the communities that we service, many of us service, where I'm dealing with first-generation students, and I'm transformational. We change lives. We not only change that student's life, but we change the lives of all the children that they'll have thereafter, because they now have a role model that has had a college degree. We need to be thoughtful of how we provide. It's not just the funds. It's about the way we think about how they access those funds and how we build models to support them.
Dr. Valek, from your perspective with community colleges, do you see do you attack it in a similar way, or do you see some differences that you use in your support services?
Well, what I would say is it sounds like our missions as far as being open access and transformational we have some very common values with Lamar University. I would say this about community colleges in general. First, we have the third lowest tuition rates in the nation. So when it comes to having a higher ed session next time, adequate funding allows us to keep those tuition rates low, and that's critically important. That's a huge part of the response. The second is, I'm keeping students in college is a challenge. Just getting them to think that they can go to college is an even bigger challenge that we've got to face. So what I and many of my colleagues are doing are putting in very new and creative approaches to intrusive advising. I know at our own institution, we have a system set up where we are having every first-time in college student have a coach that is their coach for 4 semesters. It's the same person with a curriculum for what they have to accomplish during that time. And we're approaching it from an appreciative counseling approach rather than a deficit. What are you missing? What didn't you get in high school? What don't you have at home? We're helping them learn, here's the attributes you bring. This is what you can add to the college experience. We're now into about our 4th year in that program, and we're finding a 10% difference on return rates between those who had a coach and those who didn't. So it's a huge investment of resources, as you can imagine, to have a coach that may have no more than, if it's a full-time faculty member, it'd be no more than 10 to 15 people they're working with at a time. Well, you multiply that into the thousands. We've had to add a lot of staff to do that, but I think the return on investment will be there for the outcomes. So that's just one small example, but that's how they get the sense of, I know how to navigate the system, and if I don't, I have a coach. And it's the same person I've already been to, and I know I'll see them again. And it's reaping great rewards.
Dr. Gossman.
Yes, so there are several things we're doing at the coordinating board. We obviously don't work directly with students because we have an amazing group of people who are working with students at our institutions. But a few things I'd like to highlight because you may not know about them. Firstly, we have, through the Gates Foundation, created an emergency aid network a few years ago, and they went through a year and a half or so of meetings where they came up with a final report to help institutions either build out or design an emergency aid program. So we know from data that there are students who have started their degree programs and then did not finish. And for many of them, the reason why they don't finish is because they hit a financial wall. And that wall that they're hitting to them is monumental. Whereas to us working adults, it may not, oh, we need a new set of tires. Oh, that hurts my wallet, but I can do it. But for some folks, when they hit that kind of a financial wall, it's devastating. A dead battery, new set of tires, late on your rent, behind on medical bills. Sometimes they just need a little extra financial support to help them through this issue that they're facing either with themselves or their families. So emergency aid programs are put in place to either provide grants or loans to help students get past that financial wall, that threshold, to keep them in school. And we know from some institutions that have emergency aid programs, they're seeing a 3-to-1 return on investment. So for every dollar they invest, they see 3 coming back to them through retention in students. So that's one thing that the coordinating board has been working on. And if you don't have an emergency aid program, please come talk to me. I'll tell you where the final report is and share with you some ideas on how to get that started. The other thing we're working on is through, I think it was House Bill 3808, we recommended Texas Works. We are copying, I believe, Indiana in the sense that we are converting our work-study program into a paid internship program that the state subsidizes. And we feel like this has tremendous potential for our students because not only will it help them with financial need because they'll be getting, much like work study, they'd be getting paid, but it would be more like an internship, which really just has more street cred than a work study program. That's the unfortunate reality. But also what we've done is we've baked into this idea of a paid internship program sponsored by the state that the marketable skills, which is one of the other goals of 60 by 30 Techs, the marketable skills that'll be offered in this internship program will be transparent to the students who get the award. So I have many more ideas, but I'm going to stop there.
Okay, you brought it up, so I have to ask: How do you apply for that, or how can you? When does that program take effect? Because obviously the bill just passed this past session, right?
It did. So my understanding, which is not exact, but I know who to ask. That's what I'm really good at. I know who to ask. So I believe that starts next FY, not this academic year, but next academic year, because we need to plan it out. But we created a Texas Internship Toolkit, which is actually for employers to help them either design or adapt their current program to be more aligned with 60 by 30 Techs. And we're using that toolkit as sort of a layout for how we're going to design the Texas Work internship programs. It'll also be very much tied to the Texas Internship Talent Challenge, which is a tri-agency effort. TWC has this on their website. You can go look for internships on their challenge website. So we're going to make sure that it's very much aligned with that program too.
May I just,
Please.
Consistent with this theme is that we also live in an interesting area where these little things like Harvey and Imelda kind of happen as well. And so the consequences for a student, staff, faculty, in terms of providing crisis funding at that moment, it's stunning how the public turns out. We have just been overwhelmed by the generosity of our community in helping our faculty, staff, and students with the support here or there. Many of our students were living in first-floor apartments that were flooded, and so they've lost their computers and their books, and to be able to give them some support is really critical in getting them past that hump. So there are little things that can make an immense difference.
Ms. Wills, I wanted to give you a chance to just talk about student debt in general and just kind of the efforts in the state and locally, just, areas that you see that are, we can improve upon.
You said student debt, right? Yeah. So I want to sort of center or mention that not everyone experiences student debt the same way. It was sort of mentioned earlier that like an average is just that, it's an average, and it can obscure the what's actually happening beneath that number, right? But I can tell you that, for example, Black and brown students are especially impacted by student debt, right? A recent SMU report showed that the average Black student, in order to get a 4-year degree, everything else being equal, has to borrow about $7,000 more, everything else being equal, than their white counterparts. And there's a lot there, right? There's historical racial wealth gaps and additional challenges that these students face, right? So solutions that are considerate and equitable in their approach would be one important focus. I think that non-traditional students, people often say non-traditional students, though in Texas, most students are quote-unquote non-traditional, and that means, I guess people consider a traditional student someone that goes straight from high school into a 4-year, graduates in 4 years and is done, right? But non-traditional students make up a lion's share of the students in Texas, but they don't get a lion's share of the support from the Texas Legislature, right? So when you compare students at public 4-year universities versus students at public 2-year universities, of those who demonstrate financial need, at 4-year universities, about 20% actually get support from the state. At 2-year universities, 9% of those students. That's a huge gap, right? And we can hear from both of those numbers that not enough people get support from the state in general, right? But that gap is there, and the students at 2-year universities aren't being supported at the same rate. It's even stark when you look at even at a 4-year university, part-time versus full-time students. At public 4-year universities in Texas, if you have 20% for full-time students 20% of students who are eligible to get some sort of financial support from the state receive it. But when you look at part-time students, 2% of that same group. So student debt is a problem for most Texans, and we have to look deep into the numbers and look at certain groups, how they're especially impacted, and devise solutions that are going to close those gaps.
I do want to talk about a little bit more. We talked about navigating a difficult system when it comes to like the finances too, but I just want to talk a little bit more, and building on Dr. Valek, the counselor program that you talked about, just other innovations in terms of or support services in terms of navigating the system. Just trying to figure out what you need to take to get your degree is difficult as it is, and then the electives and things like that. But just managing that. With different requirements and with people who may not be as familiar with the system as other students, can you talk a little bit about kind of like the efforts that you do to take to make sure that you're keeping students on the right track, more specifically with the courses that they take and the advice that you give them?
I will. I'd be happy to. In fact, I think one of the things I'm proudest of is the work that we're undertaking as an association of community colleges with guided pathways. The association established the Texas Success Center a number of years ago, and that's one of their major initiatives that is grant funded. And the primary purpose of that is to be able to have pathways for students to know how to navigate regardless of where they end up going after they leave our doors. And so around the state, we have our 50 colleges in different places in their work. I know my college in particular started as one of the first cadres, so we're well on our way with having established what we call meta majors, which are general areas of study, but also having established curriculum pathways that students can access through an electronic catalog and they can look at what they need to take during the first third of their time with us, the second third, and the last third when they're getting ready to transfer. We did it like that because 80% of our students attend part-time. That's an incredible number, 80%. That rest of their life is working, raising children, and who knows what else. So they can't always take a prescribed course, but we've now been able to give them guidance to get them into a position where they know generally what they need to begin with. And then it has also helped with the advising component. We've also seen a reduction in the number of hours they're taking to degree, and that's been over each year. And we're seeing a percentage of increase in our graduation rates and our transfer rates. So it's slow, methodical work, very important work, but you know, it's all about having a clear, communicable pathway that has structure in it, rather than, oh, just take whatever you want, you're at the cafeteria.
Well, of course, the real tragedy would be when students seek advice from other students. And that always takes an interesting pathway, speaking of pathways. The term meta-major may be embedded in that is not entirely clear what exactly that means within the context of how you help a student navigate. So we'll have a student enter here and they want their pre-med, and they discover anatomy and physiology or biochem or any one of the interesting courses that tend to be sort of the gatekeepers. And then they're derailed. And as opposed to then having another space that they can occupy to be in the healthcare industry or to be in the care provision space, they think, well, I can't hit my destination, so therefore I'm either going to quit or I'm going to find another college that obviously is going to recognize my stunning brilliance, and they're going to pass me through these classes that I can't seem to pass elsewhere. The reality is that a meta major collapses a variety of different value propositions in a space. So if you're interested in service, you're interested in healthcare, there are a lot of different destinations in that space. There's social work, there's kinesiology, there's nutrition, there's a whole array of choices you can make in that domain. But if left under the old system advising, they lose track within the complexity of that environment. I might just add one additional thing in terms of intrusive advising, which we try to avoid saying too much because it has a negative connotation. But the reason why that's made possible today is because of analytics. I now have the ability to be able to track when somebody is off in terms of their destination. They're either not attending class, or they've missed a couple of assignments, or there are a number of ways that I can watch them, and as I watch them, I can then engage them and say, look, Mary, Bill, we need to be doing something to kind of help get you back on path. And it's a tremendously powerful tool.
So I'm sorry, that's really interesting. Can you build on how you're actually using that? Is that on a per student basis that you're tracking?
You can watch students on a per student basis, absolutely.
Great.
If you don't mind, I'd like to add, just because I'm really excited about what I'm hearing, and I see some potential for collaboration with something the coordinating board is working on. We are in the process of rolling out an advising chatbot called ADV. He's adorable. You should check him out. But we've rolled him out in 3 regions so far. And what we're finding, based on other experiences from other states and other institutions as well, is that chatbots are really great tools for reaching students, regardless of their age or background, because students know they're talking to a chatbot. They're not afraid to ask any question because they don't worry about judgment. And they can ask questions at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they'll get an answer. So this may be an exciting opportunity to work and make sure that we integrate guided pathways into that advising chatbot, the information, because we're in the process of training it right now. It actually takes a long time to train a chatbot to answer every question, because sometimes the question is, what's the closest pizza joint? And we still want ADV to be able to respond, because that's how it retains credibility, is being able to answer any question. Anyway, look for that. So, yeah.
Kind of like the pizza location.
We're going to open it up for audience questions in just a couple minutes. I just do have 1 or 2 more questions I'd like to ask. And the next question I want to talk about is related to business, because obviously, so much of what the 60 by 30 plan is just making sure that this state is going, we're educating our future workforce to be prepared for the jobs that are going to be there. Can you talk a little bit about whether it's partnerships with business or what more can the business community be doing to kind of make sure that they're a part of the solution that we're, of the issues that we're talking about today?
May I jump into that for
Sure.
just a second? There's a 700,000 person estimated shortfall in people that are prepared to do the coding that's necessary to build out the next gen of the various apps that we're going to need in the computer space. The reality is that there is no preparation in the K through 12 environment to train students to be able to do coding, and there's certainly no training necessarily being provided on a regular basis for the faculty. Apple approached us about being a partner and building out a system whereby we would train teachers and then in turn train these students in both the K through 12, starting really K through 5, and they're kind of bracketed depending on what you're training them to do. And then the target is to roll this out nationwide. So those kind of partnerships, along with what we do in the Port Authority environment, and we prepare people in port management and now in a space in midstream, I think the industry partnerships are critical. And whether it's the BISD, the local independent school district, and collaboration there, those are valuable in collecting, really kind of collaborating with the community, but at the same time preparing students for much needed work environment.
Dr. Valek, please.
Yeah, from a two-year perspective, I would say the connection with business and industry has been one of the hallmarks of our sector. I know in particular where I work, and I keep going back there, I'm in my 24th year there as a president, so I have a little bit of a history there, but I would tell you that the chemical manufacturing employment there is 10 times the norm in the nation. And so we have incredible job opportunities for two-year graduates with some of the highest labor market outcomes in the nation for two-year graduates. But the key to the success of these programs has been that tight partnership with industry. What they are doing is providing facilities, equipment, internships, staff. I can tell you I have an incredible cadre of retired, and they retire early, faculty members out of that industry who now are having encore careers at the college. Our biggest area, of course, is in process technology. But I think the example of what do they do to make you prepared for tomorrow is best told with an example that came up for us this year when one of our major partners there, which happens to be BASF Corporation, came to us and said, you know, there is a revolution going on in the petrochemical industry right now, and it's a huge revolution, and we're calling it 4.0. And we were kind of looking there, not really realizing what that meant, and they said, and we want to bring you along, and here's how we're going to do it, and here's what money we're going to infuse into your institution over the next 5 years. And so that's to get them ready for that next level where everything is speaking in that world that you were just talking about, and where they're talking about, you know, the use of drones instead of sending people down into tanks, and perhaps getting away from shift work because you can have a company that's in a different time zone operating your plants in this time zone, and having everything digitized and everything going to tablets, and all of that takes resources. But what I loved is that they did not get there and then come back and say, why isn't your curriculum relevant? They came and said, here's our hand, let's go forward, and here's the resources, and here's how we're going to do it together.
Dr. Gossman.
Thanks. Yes, I agree. The future of work is very much in front of mind for business and higher ed, and it presents a great opportunity for that collaboration to become more symbiotic, I think. We were definitely thinking about the future of work when we crafted the marketable skills goal, because again, we want students to understand what skills they have in their toolkit when they go out to market themselves to future employers, and the idea that they can, as you were saying, there's so many potential opportunities for students when they enter a meta major. They could take those skills and really apply it to any field that may be relevant, and we want them to be able to think that way. But definitely the fourth industrial revolution and the future of work is something that we're really thinking about at the coordinating board.
And another element that I just want to mention, mentioned as far as the business community, right? So I meant the cost of college has been going up, right? And the types of degrees and work experience that are required by many types of jobs are also increasing, right? So the business community also has the opportunity to reevaluate, what like wage trends and what people are being paid versus what's being required of students or graduates. Because maybe a degree that is specifically required that would be incredibly expensive to get, maybe there's another way to get that same skill or benefit from someone without requiring them to undergo the extreme burden of debt that they're undergoing, or not to the same degree. So as wages haven't been increasing at the same rate as the cost of college has been increasing, but the requirements are going up, there needs to be some possible reevaluation in the business community as well to address that issue.
Can I take that idea a little further? I'm going to go all the way to the other end of the spectrum and talk about a segment that community colleges serve that may not even be degree bound, but yet have a lot of value added and have life-changing value. I know we started with an experimental program where we were taking, it was grant funded so that it was a full ride, and it still continues to be a full ride for students, but the criteria was that you had to be making less than $10 an hour, and that you were in that middle range that would hit the 60 by 30 goal, and had some dependents. So, I mean, these were people that were really having a difficult time taking care of not just themselves, but dependents. And we put them into full-time 9-week programs with wraparound services that included access to food, access to childcare, access to things like how to manage a budget, and some other wraparound supports. And we found that with that very difficult population to serve, we had an 80% completion rate. And out of those who crossed the stage after 9 weeks, we made a big deal out of it. 90% were employed, and their average wage went from $9 to $24.32 in 9 weeks. And that wasn't just a phenomenon of one time, because we're now in about our 4th year, and we've seen hundreds of people go through this transformation. Now, they're only going into the industry as a helper, but look at the career track they have ahead if they continue, and now they know they've mastered some college work. They can actually go on and get a certificate and then a degree. But it's been enlightening, and you don't always have to look at it as the longest goal, but what's the shortest term goal that lets you have a meaningful wage that allows you then to work on the midterm goal?
Okay, we're going to start with questions here in a second, but I got one final question that I just want to kind of ask the group, and that is related to rural communities. And obviously we've seen some shifts in where people are moving in this state, and just the concern about, creating deserts when it comes to, higher ed in some of our less populated communities. Could you talk about, just a little bit from your perspective, maybe Dr. Gossman, I'll start with you, just in terms of what we need to be watching out for, and as we see these kind of shifts in where our population's moving, and what we need to be doing to kind of address that and make sure that there isn't that there is still quality access to higher education in these other parts of the state.
Yes, thank you. Well, we definitely want everyone in the state to succeed. That is also built into the 60 by 30 text plan, that everyone we want them to succeed. And so for our rural population, we really are hoping that the infrastructure of Wi-Fi and internet is available across the state, because we have some very rich programs that are 100% online that a student can take regardless of age, regardless of background, and access quality higher education programs that will lead to higher paying jobs across the state. In fact, we have recently launched a distance education program search on the coordinating board website, where a student can go on and search for those programs that are 100% online. And both of my colleagues here offer programs just like that.
For the first time in Lamar's history, this semester, our student credit hour count online is larger than our residential count. So we reach virtually almost every county in the state of Texas, some 38 states and 16, 18 countries around the world. It is a part of really where the next gen of higher ed has to go in order to be able to provide access to individuals who need to be educated in place. There's the other part about synchronous learning or face-to-face learning that we also need to appreciate when we have this conversation, and that is there are people that are wired to learn synchronously. I was. So when I was in the classroom, I was taking notes and I could process pretty quickly and I got it. But there are a large number of people that are equally just as capable who learn what they call asynchronously, which means that they have to access the material offline and go back to it and review it and see it in a different way and potentially see it in different modalities, visually, in writing, and potentially in audio format. So what online education does is it provides access not only to people who are remote from the standpoint of geographically, but might have been remote from the standpoint of cognitive processing as well. So that is going to be an increasingly important part of how we both provide certificates and competencies that are not necessarily degree-based, but also in terms of how we service the state from the standpoint of its broad-reaching needs.
Do you want to build on that?
Well, yeah, I also wanted to mention there are a number of cities, and there's been a lot of discussion around the matter of free community college or college promise models where students who demonstrate certain financial need, depending on the program, are getting support for their education, especially at two-year university or colleges. So there are some, we've all heard of the Dallas and the San Antonio, and there's others in a lot of big cities, right? But when you think about rural communities, and of course the online access is a great opportunity to bridge sort of that gap of not being near one of those big programs, but there was a lot of policy discussion for statewide programs, statewide college promise models this last session. And I think that conversation may need to continue for that particular reason. You know, your access to affordable higher education shouldn't really depend on what part of the state you're in.
I think, too, one of the things I would say that one of the reasons we established a committee within the community college sector called the 60 by 30 committee is to look at this whole issue of sustainability across the state, because the gap between urban colleges and rural colleges, just in terms of resources, especially in the community college sector, where a portion of your funding is based on the net assessed value of the district where your college resides. So there's a great deal of variance across the state. And so how do we sustain this network? Because the student in the rural area is important to the future of Texas.
Okay, I think we're going to open up for questions. We've got a mic back here. Just raise your hand and we'll bring it to you. Don't be shy. Okay.
Thank you so much for this lovely conversation. Andre Favors, I'm faculty here at Lamar University. I have a question about some of the programs you're talking about and the national conversations, particularly like Pell being thought about as being able to fund shorter programs like the nine-week certificate. Could you talk a little bit more how these conversations are related to federal conversations, or what you think at the federal level should be talked about in terms of these kinds of things that we're doing here in Texas?
Well, if you're looking at me, I'd argue that you've actually answered your own question. And that is that stackable certificates, which is really where the conversation has been going, particularly in graduate education, would suggest that, say you need to learn something about team management and team skills, and then communication skills here, and maybe a little bit about analytics and some core competencies in that space. And somehow that could all be assembled at some point, potentially in a degree, or maybe not. But it will advance you and give you agility in your work environment that you otherwise wouldn't have. Why is that a bad thing? And why would necessarily getting a master's in whatever the degree program that you might be pursuing be the necessary endpoint, when the reality is that those competencies are really what you're going to need? And you're going to probably have to come back and retrain anyway. You're going to have to secure additional competencies at some point. So I'd argue that that should be part of the funding domain of whatever the Fed level or state level is providing.
Okay. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Rhonda Mitchell, and I'm in the communications department at LIT. Thank you all for all your information. I did notice something that I felt like is important, and I think I need to address Ashley about this. There are quite a few minority students that might not come from the backgrounds that, you know, the ideal background. And I've had a case with this with somebody I'm actually mentoring, and she just recently dropped out. And I guess it's more of a question, you did slightly address this a little bit with having faculty maybe reach out and be counselors one-on-one, but, you know, what are the options for like a small school like LIT when you've got this kind of population and you've got these people slipping through the cracks, so to speak? What kind of options can we offer them? What can we do where this does not happen so much? I mean, I think the person I know is overwhelmed with everything, not just money, but the idea of going to school full time and the idea of going, well, we even tried to lighten their load, et cetera. But, you know, just all these things that go through their mind, it's just overwhelming, and not receiving that support from your home because, as you said, you know, a lot of these people do not come from homes where education is important. So I guess I'm just wondering if there are other alternatives or something that you see that might be viable for somebody like that.
Right. So I can say, as someone who is probably, I guess, from my background, grouped in someone that in that group, like I have that experience as well. I'm a first generation college student. Navigating higher education is incredibly difficult as a minority, and just without the social capital to really be able to call someone and say like, oh, I'm thinking about taking this class. It's a very difficult experience. What I can say from my perspective, and I bet a lot of the panelists have great ideas and have done a lot of programmatic work, but I can say that without a doubt, state support is required for the kind of supports that students need to really have their issues addressed, right? Without the money for these types of programs, that these amazing and really pioneering programs, they can't happen. So from my perspective, I think state funding is even more important because of that reason, because not everyone experiences higher education the same way. A lot of us face barriers as we're navigating these different types of systems, and I can speak to that, but I know that there are probably other specific options that maybe I can't speak to.
I guess if I were going to speak from a institutional perspective on policy on that, you know, resources are important to be able to have the program, absolutely. Your policies then have to make them non-optional. A student like you've described isn't gonna opt into having a coach. They're not gonna opt into maybe visiting the math center if that's where the overwhelming is, or your wellness program where you may have a food pantry or emergency aid fund. You've got to have somebody getting them to the resources and that in a manner where it becomes proactive rather than reactive, because by then it's too late. You know, the beauty of emergency funds and we learned a lot through Harvey. This was one of the positive things, the rest wasn't. But just a little bit of money that you can get access on within 24 hours can really save a student. It can't be a program, well, in 2 weeks we'll see if your request was approved, because then it's too late. So that kind of institutional policy, and for that to be effective then, it means there has to be a true cultural buy-in at the institution, because they're going to turn to somebody, if they turn at all, and it may not be the one that's been assigned to be the helper, but it's got to be somebody who's willing to say, go here, go there.
May I add to that? We have created receiving environments, which are like student interest groups or learning communities or whatever you might want to call them. Some schools call them freshman interest groups. It depends on where you're at, where a small group of students, 15-ish, 10, 15 students, are typically gathered around a common interest, whatever that might be. And it's an easier space for the student to receive that help because they're not labeled. If they're touched by the policy, then there's oftentimes the perception that they're being stereotyped in some way as having a problem. But if they're received in a community of like students who are supportive of them, it's often a much more effective tool.
I think we've got time for one more question. Oh, right here. Yes, sir.
Thank you all for an insightful discussion. I'm Ray Martinez. I'm the president of the association that represents all the private not-for-profit institutions here in the state. And we're very fortunate in Texas that we have, for many years now, state-funded financial aid programs for each of the major sectors of higher education in the state. So Texas grants for the public universities, TEOG for community colleges, and what we call TEG, the Equalization Grant Program, for private university students. And I'm wondering, as I hear you all talking about the fact that today the face of a typical student is much more an adult learner or perhaps a non-traditional student than it is a traditional student. And that's true increasingly so for the private universities as well. You think of them as residential, traditional age students, but that's diversifying as well even in our private universities. Is it time for us to think differently about our state-funded financial aid programs to ensure that we can give access to Texas grants or to TEOG or to TEG for non-traditional age students? And any thoughts about that?
I would say absolutely. Adult learners are an incredibly important part. I think that all the way from the very beginning. So it's often missed that Texas is usually the worst or second worst when it comes to high school credential attainment in the country. We have had some really great progress this last session as far as getting adult learners the opportunity to go straight from a high school equivalency exam like a GED into the higher education pipeline. Changes like that will help, and subsidies to take these types of exams. But before that, I mean, I think that the adult learner group of students has not received the attention they should receive. But if we're hoping to get to 60 by 30, I'm not an expert on it, as Ginger may be, but I would assume that we have to include adult learners if we're going to get to that goal.
Yes, we absolutely have to include adult learners, or returning adult students, if we're going to get to the 60% by 2030. So I think that's a really great idea for us to explore. And I don't disagree. I'm just thinking about that high school to college percentage that's been going down, the one target we're not really doing well at. And I don't want there to be a disconnect between our policy, our funding policies, and driving that target as well. But you're absolutely right. We can't get there without returning adult students. So I don't have the right answer, but I will say we need to do both. Absolutely.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it at that. Please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists for a wonderful discussion. Thank you guys so much. And thank you to Lamar University again. Thanks, everyone.